right, good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Hauser, the Student Programs Coordinator here at the Cato Institute, and I'm excited to kick off our annual Libertarianism versus Conservatism debate. Tonight, these four distinguished interns will attempt to answer the question, is libertarianism or conservatism the superior political philosophy? Clearly, people care about this question. We have a full house here tonight, and many more are watching online. And it should come as no surprise that people care. What we're doing here tonight is both interesting and important. Libertarianism and conservatism are often lazily lumped together as nearly interchangeable constituents of the American political right. This characterization isn't very useful or informative. The fact that you're all here tonight means that you're not satisfied with carelessly conflating two political philosophies. A debate over minutiae or merely academic distinctions wouldn't draw this kind of crowd. You recognize that libertarianism and conservatism have significant, meaningful differences, and that those differences are worth exploring. I appreciate your interest in this discussion. I hope you'll leave tonight with a clear understanding of the differences between libertarianism and conservatism, and a better awareness of what those differences mean for public policy and the future of this country. After the conclusion of the debate, we encourage you to join us for a reception where I suspect round two of the debate will begin. That reception will take place on both this floor in the Winter Garden, which is the lobby, and also up the spiral staircase on the second floor. But you don't have to wait until after the debate to begin participating. I encourage you all to share your thoughts about the debate on Twitter and other social media using the hashtag LVCdebate, which, yes, is behind me. Another important way that I ask you to participate in tonight's debate is by responding to the email survey, which should be sent to you shortly after the debate tonight. Please respond to it quickly. That data could be important for media follow-up to this debate, so I'd appreciate you checking your email tonight, early tomorrow, and responding to that survey as quickly as possible. Now, before we begin the actual debate, I'd like you to notice that the teams are labeled conservatism and libertarianism, not heritage and Cato. These interns do not represent and will not be speaking on behalf of either the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. Please respect this distinction, especially if you're posting about the debate on social media. Don't get me in trouble. I would like to host this debate again next year. Speaking of hosting this debate, I'd like to thank Cato's outstanding event staff for handling the logistics of this event. I would also like to thank Heather Fitzenmeyer and Eleanor Renner of the Heritage Foundation. Heather and Eleanor had countless meetings, phone calls, and email exchanges with Katie Ranville, who is our student programs associate here at Cato, and myself in order to prepare for this debate. So I appreciate all the work that they put in to make this event happen. I would also like to give a shout out to Tucker Omberg here up front. He did a lot of research assistance for this debate, and he'll be helping us with our timing tonight. So thank you, Tucker. The final person I need to thank is Christopher Bedford, who has agreed to be our moderator for tonight's debate. Christopher is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller News Foundation and a senior editor at the Daily Caller, where he writes a weekly column. He's the vice chairman of the conservative Young Americans for Freedom Board of Governors, where he refounded its magazine, The New Guard. He was a fellow at the Fusionist Young Conservatives Coalition and was an associate at the Libertarian Charles G. Koch Institute. In spite or because of all that, his conservative friends find him annoyingly libertarian, and his libertarian friends regard him as an acceptable fascist. His mother simply thinks he's a radical. In the media, he has worked as a reporter, a columnist, an editor, and a news chief, running 3 different newsrooms. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and Politico, as well as on Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. Please help me welcome Christopher Bedford.
Thank you for that introduction and for having me here today, everyone. I've been coming to these since 2010 because they're absolutely amazing. The room is packed. There's rooms all around us that are full of people, and there's folks that are watching this on live stream. And we're all here for a clash of ideas, an intellectual battle, a debate, and the kind of things that you would normally, words you'd use to characterize a negative thing, a bad thing, a civil war on the right, if you will. But it's actually quite the opposite. This shows the vibrancy of the ideas on the right. The fact that young people, in this case all young men, want to come to Washington, D.C., but young ladies throughout the whole audience, and young Bruce Jenners, want to come to D.C. not just to get coffee, but to talk about ideas and try to figure it out and try to solve the world. That's fantastic. You don't hear that in the left. You're never going to hear in this room tonight, the science is settled, the debate is over. You're not going to hear, you can't say that. You're going to lose your job. Well, actually, you may lose your jobs if you say something. He's watching. But it's also an old debate. the debate between conservatism and libertarianism wasn't solved in the pages of National Review by Russell Kirk and Frank Myers. We're probably not going to solve it tonight. But the history of debate is even older than that. It was huge with the Sons of Liberty and the founding of the United States, at that time over beers, which some of us will be having later. And then the Federalist Papers, something that is cherished by Cato and cherished by Heritage. These papers were debates, people putting their ideas out there, people fighting, the best minds in Western civilization, not afraid to confront each other. And it's something which has kind of been put by the wayside in the United States, something that has been overshadowed by shouting matches on television, which can be entertaining, but aren't as illuminating and aren't as vibrant intellectually as I think the conversation we're going to have here tonight. Excuse me. Today's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. And keep in mind, I know at least when I started coming here in 2010, it's like, oh yeah, get them. We're going to win. We're going to crush the opposition. And it switches from year to year what you think. Your ideas are not set in stone. Everyone's here not just to cheer for their team, but to learn. We're trying to sharpen our ideals. It's important practice to debate, whether it's at the kitchen or here on the stage, to be able to understand your ideas so well that you can defend them. And also to learn about your opponent's ideas and see maybe you were wrong here, maybe you changed. Whether it's Bill Buckley or whoever you have, their ideas have changed over decades. And these are people who we consider founders of the modern conservative movement, the libertarian movement, or at least founders of the right. Let's settle on that. So to that measure, some of the rules I would like are for people to show their approval with applause, and please keep from booing. You guys can fight it out afterwards off Cato property. To tweet, you can be as mean as you want on Twitter. LVC debate is the hashtag. To turn off your cell phones so we don't have that shooting off. One thing that we have here that the Sons of Liberty didn't have, or they would have coordinated better. They actually probably would have been busted when they broke onto that ship to vandalize it. There's been a coin toss. Heritage Foundation won the coin toss. So in the history of preemptive strikes, they decided to go first. They will open with 5 minutes at the podium, followed by Cato Institute with 5 minutes. And then from their desks, they'll have 3-minute rebuttals that go back and forth. And that'll go through a number of questions, which I have figured. And no, we're not going to debate weed, because we do that every year, and I'm sick of it. After that, we'll have a conversation on why conservatives should be libertarian, why libertarians should be conservative. I expect that to get feisty. And then we're going to have a question and answer period. And if whatever question you're thinking of starts with, have you ever heard of de Maistra, or some other really long rant, it's not a question, and I'm going to tell you to stop. And move on to the next question. We shall begin. Heritage Foundation, would you like to start off? Oh, excuse me, you know what? Let me introduce who we have up here, representing not Heritage, conservatives. We have Cato for Will Duffield for Libertarians, and Charles Lehman. We have Cameron Swarthwald and Will Duffield for Conservatism. Who would like to begin?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to also extend a big thank you to the Cato Institute, Christopher Bedford, Heather Fitzenmeyer, Eleanor Renner, and everyone else who made this event possible. Tonight, Cameron and I are going to prove that tried and true conservatism is a superior political philosophy to that of fledgling libertarianism. Now, when we say conservatism, we're not talking about neoconservatism, compassionate conservatism, or any other hybrid. We are not here to defend any one politician. We are here to advocate for a philosophy that follows in the tradition of the Founding Fathers, focusing on the sustainability of society, the securing of the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. When talking about libertarianism, we are not referring to the Tea Party, social conservatism, or the sense of frustration caused by abandonment of conservative principles within the Republican Party. The definition comes from the central fundamental tenets of libertarianism and its logical subsidiary beliefs. At times, we will mention a libertarian author, not with the intention of attacking him specifically, but rather to illustrate how libertarianism goes astray. Now that we've narrowed the focus of our debate, let us look at why conservatism is a reliable political philosophy and why libertarianism is dangerous. Conservatism as an American political theory boils down to a quote from the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That is what we believe. A true conservative fights for the rule of law, fights for the free exercise of religion, fights for families, fights for a strong military to protect us from those who would harm, fights for the God-given rights of the individual, and fights for the stable passing of our ordered liberties to our children so that the good we do here might endure. The government is our insurance policy. As Ronald Reagan once said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Libertarianism does not hold this view. It is an archipelago view of politics. It is laissez-faire capitalism, an economic theory inherently about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. It is laissez-faire capitalism masquerading as a political philosophy, dealing with the governance of man. The archipelago or island view encompasses the three central ideological tenets of libertarianism. 1, individualism, 2, the non-aggression principle, and 3, one that necessarily follows from the prior two, that there is no binding duty. With this theory, everyone lives on their own island. You can build bridges to other islands only when there is mutual consent. Because you are an autonomous ruler of your own island, you do not have a duty to anyone, not even your own family. The prominent libertarian Murray Rothbard logically concludes in his Ethics of Liberty that parents should be allowed to watch their child starve to death without any legal culpability. Ponder that for a moment. We should all find this disturbing. This hands-off view of politics, although sound in analysis of markets, when blindly applied to the political arena, logically produces fatal results. You cannot apply the principles of the invisible hand and competition to every aspect of governing people. If I apply the strategy of checkers to a game of chess, I will probably have a strong pawn structure, control of the center, and proper development of my pieces, but I will miss the beauty of a combinational checkmate or the nuances and analysis of trading a bishop for a knight. In the same way, do the laws of economics apply to government policy? Libertarianism is simply a 1970s offshoot from the trunk of conservatism. It borrows from the overbranching conservative tree sound concepts regarding liberty, the economy, and the overreaching size of the administrative state. Conservatism more comprehensively looks at lessons we learned from prior civilizations, from the wisdom of the founders, and a rich heritage of thought that can be applied to the changing cultural, technological, and geopolitical landscape. Conservatism is not a movement that unifies an eclectic assortment of persons and animosity towards government, but rather a bastion of sound political philosophy for just rule. For these reasons, we look to the common law principles of the past to prudently navigate through the present, so that our children's children may possess the same gifts God has blessed us with. Thank you.
At first glance, it seems that libertarianism and conservatism share much in common. We both revere America's establishment as a constitutional republic. We respect the wisdom of our founders. Together, we resist the left's attempts to plan and regulate our economy, or to revolutionize our society and traditions through force of law. However, we are divided by our understandings of the acceptable role and extent of state power and its capacity to constructively alter society. Libertarians believe that government should only be used to set general rules for society, laws protecting our rights to life, liberty, and property. Law should not be used to restrict the ebb and flow of social norms, but to resolve disputes between persons, ensuring that they do not harm one another in the pursuit of their goals. Within the framework of these general rules, what Milton Friedman called the rules of the game, libertarians believe that a just, productive, and happy civil society will thrive. Free associations, be they businesses, families, churches, or civic associations, respond to the specific wants of their members better than any government. The conservative, however, would do much more with the power of government. He would use it to restrict what we may put into our bodies, what sorts of relationships we may enter into. He would use it to assert the primacy of his values, of his conception of the good. He would use young American men and women to police the world, while granting our executive the position of global judge, jury, and executioner. In this debate, you may hear libertarian views derided as fanciful, radical, or unrealistic. Do not be deceived by the words of our opponents. True radicalism is the belief that the state can and should control what people put in their bodies. On this point, make no mistake, there is no principled difference between the war on drugs and Bloomberg's big soda ban. It is truly unrealistic to believe that a government we both consider incapable of administering a healthcare system can invade and remake a foreign country or read our emails without malfeasance. Does Lois Lerner have to run the NSA before conservatives realize their folly? Sadly, conservatives and left liberals seem to agree in their endorsements of planning. They view laws as tools, boundlessly capable of correcting social deficiency. In understanding laws for what they are, libertarians are the prudent moderates. Laws are not suggestions, they are not polite requests or helpful hints for better living. By definition, they are concrete demands backed by the threat of violence. When Christian bakers are fined hundreds of thousands of dollars for asserting their rights of conscience, when the IRS is used to punish Tea Party groups, conservatives should recognize the fearsome power of government for what it is. State power, even power gathered for explicitly conservative ends, may later be used to run roughshod over those who stand athwart history yelling stop. A libertarian government, even one disagreeable to the conservative, would allow him his separate peace. A powerfully traditionalist regime leaves little room for the dissenting individual or family. A government capable of policing the bedrooms of its citizens, able to root out and remove vice from society, leaves no man's home his castle and renders all mere supplicants of the state. A government with the power to establish the right culture may just as easily, either through malice or mere accident, instantiate the wrong culture. In the words of Ronald Reagan, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Conservatives would create a government with the capacity to wipe away all that they hold dear. A nation on the edge of a precipice, always but one election away from oblivion. Libertarians would create a general government, under which the good in life may be discovered and proven through trial and error, a government that accepts the limits of its knowledge and power. Libertarians understand that both the economy and society are organic and would allow them to develop naturally, free from the corrosive influence of well-meaning censors or regulators. By leaving planning to the people, not government, by consistently and prudently applying a presumption of liberty, libertarianism proves itself to be the superior political philosophy. Thank you.
Those are pretty good. I've seen in years past sometimes things go off the rails pretty quickly. I think we're going to have a really intelligent debate. And now that we've had the opening statements, we'll go into the debate where there's still time to go off these rails. Heritage, you have a 3-minute from your desk rebuttal.
If you believe everything that should be bought and sold on an open market, except politicians, you might be a libertarian. As a conservative, I too believe that politicians shouldn't be bought and sold. I think that the reason for this is self-evident. But there's no principle within libertarianism that says we cannot buy and sell politicians. In the same way, there's no principle for not selling human flesh for either consumption or for research purposes. It's just an addendum of belief that some libertarians have. Some claim that libertarianism is an inherently coherent philosophy, but libertarianism is simply disappointing in this regard. For instance, I'm disappointed with libertarianism for, as we saw in the opening, conflating big liberal government with small, limited government that the conservatives hold dear. I'm also disappointed with libertarianism for its claim to value life, when, in fact, it really doesn't. Take the abortion, for instance. Libertarians like to avoid this issue because they are divided on it. Yet, there are logical reasons for their chasm. Approximately 44% of libertarians support abortion on demand. The fetus is an unwelcome parasite in the woman's uterus and violates her rights. Therefore, the woman may abort it. Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard, Benjamin Tucker, and Walter Block all legitimize this view as rational consequences of individualism. Whether or not the fetus is a baby does not affect the argument. An additional 23% of libertarians acknowledge the fetus as human, but still believe the mother's individual autonomy trumps the rights of the little one. 16% of libertarians are anti-abortion, and at the moment of conception, embryonic cells are living and identify as human through their DNA, so there's unquestionably human life. The DNA is distinct from the mother's DNA, so it is a separate human life. These libertarians, like Ron Paul, reason that the mother may not initiate aggression by killing the baby who has the same rights as any other person. Both of these views are tenable following fundamental libertarian philosophy. However, this cannot be the case according to the rules of logic. X cannot equal P and negative P at the same time. For libertarianism to be a valid philosophy, its guiding principles cannot support two fundamentally contradictory views. The free market will not produce a loophole to the principle of non-contradiction. The only thing it might do, as we found in the Planned Parenthood footage from last week, is cause a doctor to crush a baby's skull with his forceps while carefully leaving its organs intact. That way its liver, heart, and limbs might be sold. Libertarianism identifies that there is a market for everything. This is true. However, it disappoints with its silence on whether certain markets should exist.
Cato? Libertarians?
That one. So I'm going to start with abortion and work my way backwards. I'm a little concerned that my conservative opponents think that there ought to be unanimity on the topic of abortion within the libertarian movement when conservative idols ranging from Barry Goldwater to St. Augustine are divided over the topic. If they would like to claim that conservatism is in and of itself a coherent philosophy, it will not, in fact, be in line with the history of that movement or our movement. Indeed, I'm a little worried that my opponents think that they're debating against Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard, when indeed neither myself nor Will are either an objectivist or an anarchist. What we are principled libertarians. To wit, the libertarian movement goes back further than the 1970s. Indeed, libertarians and conservatives found themselves on the same side of a conflict that dated at least to the New Deal, when they found themselves being the single minority standing against big government and the encroaching of the state upon society. Libertarianism is not about markets and everything, although we do like free markets. Libertarianism is about a simple political project and a vision that goes with that project. The political project, as I said, is simple. More freedom, less government. Not no government. And I'm concerned that my conservative opponents might think that we would like that. We wouldn't. There's a role for the state in society, just like there's a role for lots of other things. There's a role for the state to be a kind of what Ludwig von Mises talked about as the night watchman, maintaining security and setting up what both Will and Milton Friedman talk about as the rules of the game, the fair rule of law that establishes a civil society. Beyond that, though, libertarians are not interested in any kind of archipelago philosophy. And anyone who understands how a free market works and looks at the complex interrelations that derive it, the structure of both dependency, independency, and interdependency that is essential to having the kind of free market that libertarians envision, can understand that libertarians do not want to be individualists. What we want is for the state, the large, brutal state that destroys families with its war on drugs, that destroys free exchange with its massive overregulation backed up by violent force, should get out of the way. What the libertarian wants is for people, free people, to solve their own problems, not necessarily as men who are islands, but as people who are not forced to fall in line with any particular moral agenda by the use of force. The libertarian society envisions no men as island. Rather, it's a far more organic one than the conservatives would like.
Thank you. Now we get to the fun part where I get to ask questions of the conservatives and the libertarians. If you've had whiskeys over in my kitchen, you may recognize some of these points. They have been discussed before, and I'm sure they will be discussed again. The breakdown is going to be 3 minutes for one side, 3-minute answer, and then a 1-minute rebuttal and a 1-minute rebuttal, going back and forth. And we'll start off with the conservatives. The first question: religion should be restricted to the private sphere. Conservatives, you have 3 minutes.
Before we address this issue, I'd like to lay down some terms so as to avoid any potential confusion. The public sphere is the realm of a person's life that involves the government, their job, and any activities in the community at large. A concept that we often refer to, civil society, encompasses everything within the public sphere aside from government. The private sphere, on the other hand, consists of a person's activity within their own home and with their immediate family. Now that we're clear on what we're talking about, conservative stance is that religion should be welcomed in the public sphere. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This means that there is no state-sponsored church, the government does not tell us which religion is better than another, and it cannot prevent anyone from living their faith. Libertarianism, in of itself, does not promote the imprisonment of religion. Aside from the irony of a libertarian forcing an ideology that confines religion behind closed doors on Christians, Jews, Muslims, and etc., this invasion is destructive for 3 reasons. Number one, it's an attack on religious liberty. Some libertarians are trying to sell us the liberal lie that free exercise means freedom of worship, aka we won't prosecute you if you worship behind closed doors. Persons of faith should not undergo high-tech lynchings for what they believe. We already have examples of invasions into persons' ability to practice their faith in business. Ask the Little Sisters of the Poor about the HHS mandate, or the Oregon bakers, who our libertarian friends mentioned, about not baking a cake for personal religious views. In a political climate that openly wars over the hearts and minds of its people, this imprisonment of religion is not conducive to the free market of ideas. Number two, taking religion from the public arena cramps inherent human tendencies. Edmund Burke once said that man by his constitution is a religious animal. 78% of Americans, according to a 2013 Gallup poll, say that religion plays at least an important role in their lives. There is no reason for this anti-religious movement to bombard the silent majority. And lastly, it creates bigger government. Many religious charities involving the poor, sickly, and the orphaned will close down if they're not able to follow their beliefs in public. No one wants the government taking on the responsibility for these projects. These are the conservative reasons for continuing to allow religion to remain in the public sphere, and hopefully they're yours as well.
Do the libertarians disagree?
Sure. So my opponent has, I think, a little bit begged the question in as much as he has suggested that we should understand the public sphere to involve everything that happens outside of my bedroom and my living room. Libertarians don't agree with that. Libertarians certainly don't think that, for example, a bakery should be forced to pay $135,000 because they happen to disagree with somebody else's private transaction. Indeed, the free market is generally considered to be in the private sphere, and I'm a little confused as to why it was classified otherwise. That having been said, the libertarian principle that governs the principles at stake here is as follows. Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the beginning and end. People should be free to practice their religion in free civil society, interacting with other free individuals, and it should have no place in the state. Why is that the case? Indeed, our founders have believed this principle when they laid down law. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison all believed in the separation of church and state. Madison wrote, "The purpose of separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries." What's going on there? State power, when placed in the hands of a particular religious minority, has by and large been used to abuse other religious minorities. This isn't even just in Europe. This is in our own country throughout the 19th century, when whole political parties were constituted around trying to drive out Catholics. Let us not, of course, forget the insufferable violence done to Mormons, by and large by other religious actors trying to abuse state power. And so when we talk about religion being restricted to the private sphere, what we mean is that the state ought have no preference towards religion, that the state should indeed make no law regarding an establishment of religion, nor trying to introduce religion into its discourse, for the securing of religious liberty, for the securing of that free exercise. Because where one religion rules, there will be no free exercise. Even to perhaps be slightly more charitable to my conservative friends, if we do not want a state religion, which they don't, but simply want religiously inspired legislation or public action, there are reasons there to keep the religion out of the state too. That's because religion decays the state decays religion. Robert Wicks writes, when religion and state wed, religious practices give way to state practice and not the other way around. You do not see government unionized workers selling their worldly possessions and working to serve the poor, but you do see people ignoring their own religious tenets in order to qualify for government funds. Libertarians do not want to force people to pay large sums of money to not engage in freedom of conscience. What we do want is for religious interest to be secured and for free exercise to be secured by keeping religion out of the state and thereafter out of the public sphere.
1 minute rebuttal from the conservatives.
Logically, libertarians should be all for people exercising their religious liberty in public, and our libertarian friends agree with us on this. We're just playing word games, essentially, arguing over what the public sphere is. If you look it up on a common dictionary online, the common understanding of what the public sphere is will fall under the definition I put forth. In this regard to religion being in the government, I think the libertarian position so far has grossly misunderstood and overcharacterized the conservative position. What we are arguing about is the central fundamental tenets of libertarianism and what they lead to. We don't think you guys should support restricting religion to only the private sphere. We agree it should be in civil society. I don't understand what the reason is for trying to attack conservatism in such a way as to make it seem like we're trying to force our beliefs on anyone. That is not the case.
Thank you. 1 minute from libertarians.
So we seem to be having a bit of a agreement rather than an argument. However, I think the libertarian point comes down as such. We would build a wall around religion, not to restrict religion, but to restrict the state from encroaching upon it. We see again and again throughout American history, as my partner pointed out, whenever we allow religion into the state, whenever we allow individuals to bring religion's preferences not into the voting booth, but into state policy, we find ourselves in conflicts between religion using government power. And this is unhealthy and unhelpful for the sort of vibrant civil society that libertarians would like to see, for the role of religion in society that libertarians would like to see. We shouldn't be fighting about which religious textbook we use in our schools. In fact, we should be allowing parents to choose the sorts of schools their kids go to on their own and leaving that sort of function out of government.
Well, we're in agreement. If this was a cable show, we'd all be canceled. So fortunately, we're just practicing. Maybe this one will throw you. U.S. immigration policy focuses too much on security at the expense of liberty. We'll start off with the libertarian 3-minute answer.
So as an objective fact, it is clearly the case that the status quo, security trumps liberty in the U.S. immigration policy. If you don't believe me, you can take a look at the complexity of doing something as simple as acquiring a visa or a green card. It can take you up to 10 years and hundreds of documents, and that's if you're a skilled laborer. Never mind if you're trying to come into the country to work. What are the consequences? One estimate suggests that restrictions on open borders result in the global loss of between $35 trillion and $105 trillion per year, per year. So the question really ought to be, should security trump liberty? Let's compare. Security is, despite what our conservative friends might suggest, not really a substantive issue. Immigrant crime is one thing they'll bring up. at which point we'll compare the fact that the U.S.-born incarceration rate is 3.5%, and the immigrant or foreign-born incarceration rate is 0.86%. Immigrants have been decreasingly likely to be incarcerated over the past 40 years, going down each census period. And over the last 10 years, average natives are 4 to 5 times more crime-prone than immigrants. Indeed, cities with more immigrants have lower crime rates. Terrorism is another threat that our friends are concerned about. Luckily, there's a gentleman at a small think tank called the Heritage Foundation, who back in 2014 wrote that illegal immigrants engaging in terrorism has so far been rare. It may have changed since then, I'm not sure, maybe they'll tell us. But to talk about the benefits of liberty for a minute, I think they're twofold, both practical and principled. In principle, the American system traditionally has tended towards free and open immigration. Congress has no power, constitutionally delegated, to limit immigration, only to make rules regarding naturalization. And for the first century of the Republic, up until 1875, there were no federal immigration restrictions. There is a long common law tradition, in which our friends should agree with, which encourages free and open borders and the free travel between those. But, what are we losing out on when we increase security at the expense of liberty? We're losing out on a huge increase in human capital reserves. There will be, quite simply, more people if we had less immigration restriction. One estimate suggests we would have a population of 700 million if there had been no immigration restrictions since 1920. And there'd be huge economic benefits. Free exchange of people, like free trade, makes people better off. Again, 35 to 105 trillion globally per year because of global restrictions on immigration. The influx of foreign-born workers between 1990 and 2004 raised native-born Americans' wages by 2% because of complementarity in the market. And immigrants are 30% more likely than native-born Americans to start their own business. Look, immigrants are people just like you and I. They want to get by. They want to help their families. They want to live the American dream. I don't understand why we shouldn't let them. I hope my conservative friends will explain, but until then, we ought to prefer liberty over security.
What say the conservatives?
On July 1st, 2015, Kate Steinle and her father walked arm in arm down Pier 14 in San Francisco. They were, in the words of her father, enjoying a wonderful day. Suddenly, shots rang out. The last thing Kate said before she died was, "Help me, Dad." Her killer? Someone who shouldn't have been here. He had been convicted of 7 felonies and deported 5 times as an illegal immigrant. Before stepping too far into this topic, we must ask ourselves a question. Whose liberty and whose security are we talking about? We can approach this topic from a number of different angles. We can look at this unquestionably lagging issue from the perspective of Americans and/or illegal immigrants. So let's look at how immigration policy affects both of these groups. American citizens don't have much at stake when you consider the liberty side of this question. Regardless of whether the border is open or not, tomorrow I will still eat my Chipotle, ride the metro, and attend St. Joseph's on the Hill. The only long-term concern I could have regarding my liberty would be when I can afford to start traveling. Perhaps a stricter policy would be an inconvenience. In regards to security, American citizens like Kate Steinle do have a stake in this issue. This was a preventable tragedy. Now, when we're looking at the illegal immigrant, it is almost the exact opposite. They are the ones who will have their freedom to come across our border restricted, yet they face no security threats. We all recognize that the U.S. government is primarily responsible for American citizens. For instance, everyone would be furious if the government gave our Social Security to the elderly in China. Conservatism realized that America needs to look out for her citizens first. The same goes for the government of Canada for his citizenry, that of the United Kingdom for hers, and etc. Moving towards secure borders minimally infringes on the rights of a few of our citizens visiting other countries and can only help Americans in regards to security. No one denies that we need immigration reform. So let's do it responsibly. And here's 3 steps to do so. 1.
Oh, wait, 1 minute?
Yes, sir.
Excuse me.
We need to secure our borders. In addition to protecting our citizens like Kate from random acts of violence, we need to safeguard ourselves from planned acts of terror. To answer their question, a threat like ISIS. A report that came out this morning from the Migration Policy Institute estimates that there are 690,000 illegal immigrants who have been convicted of a felony or of a serious demeanor in the U.S. today. 640,000 arrived here within the last year. Number two, we need to expedite the immigration process for those who wish to come here legally and are already in line. It's a matter of justice, pure and simple. And lastly, we need to make it easier for people of goodwill to come here to work and to form a new life. This is the prudent path. This is the just path. This is the conservative path. May Kate rest in peace, and may such avoidable tragedy no longer come to pass.
Good thing I can read signs. I must be an editor. I stick to the slideshows. 1 minute from the Libertarians.
So, firstly, to my conservative friends, data is not the plural of anecdote. You've given us one story. We've given you the statistics. Immigrants are less likely to shoot folks than natural-born Americans. Now, secondly, our conservative friends told us that Americans don't have much liberty at stake. I would ask them what they think of the liberty to hire the best employee for the job. I would ask them what they think of the liberty to trade with those you want to exchange goods with. I would ask them what they think of the liberty to marry someone you love who may have been born in another country. Obviously, we are for arresting criminals, but we must think of the best ways to do it. Will you catch more immigrant criminals by alienating immigrant communities or by welcoming them into our nation? Thank you.
What do you think, conservatives?
United States citizenship is not a right. It's a privilege. It would be ludicrous if I asserted that I was entitled to citizenship in Spain. There is no basis for the United States to feel compelled to guard the liberties of other countries' citizenry while its primary responsibility is to the American people. Our libertarians friends tonight threw up a smoke screen when they started throwing out all these numbers about the economy. That's not what this topical debate is about. It's about security versus liberty. The economy is just a distracting factor. Our friends also misunderstand the basis of liberty. It is based on social liberty. If there is no stability, then what's the good of liberty? Americans have been blessed with high numbers of persons who wish to immigrate here, and we recognize that. As with any abundant harvest, we don't want the bad apple that slips into the basket to spoil the good effect otherwise caused by the whole.
I think we found a point of contention. Let's go for another. Edward Snowden's actions were justified. We'll start with 3 minutes from the conservatives.
In dealing with Edward Snowden's unjustified actions, we'll look primarily at the work of one Dr. Jim Carafano and his 2014 article, Snowden is a Traitor in All But Name. The first point is that Snowden damaged the United States and aided its enemies. Snowden claimed a noble purpose, to expose the wrongdoing of totalitarian regimes. But in practice, he spilled secrets from nations like the US, Britain, and Australia, countries that organize the humanitarian missions, champion human rights, and hold fair elections. Regardless of his intentions, Snowden's actions undercut the world's champions of freedom and gave aid and comfort to the world's totalitarian regimes. Second, we see that Snowden's leaks were indiscriminate. He leaked upwards of 1.5 million intelligence and military documents. We still don't know exactly how many he stole, and there's no way he read all of them. Further, even if there were problems with some of the programs he discussed, the fact that he leaked so many countless others, doing actual harm to the US and its allies, outweighs this. It's a numbers game, and Mr. Snowden lost. The vast majority of these documents expose no wrongdoing whatsoever, and were intelligence programs directed outside the country that had nothing to do with supposed privacy rights. For example, he exposed an intelligence sharing agreement between Australia and Indonesia, something that greatly aided both of these countries in cooperating on issues like refugees and human trafficking. Such cooperation was necessarily highly secret, and now thanks to Mr. Snowden, it's over. Everyone lost here except for him. Even if some of these programs, for our third point, which were regularly subjected to oversight and review, were problematic, Snowden's actions are still an irresponsible betrayal of trust. Democracies operate under the concept of ordered liberty. They establish rules to protect the individual and the community as a whole, guarding individual freedom and public safety. Flouting ordered liberty doesn't advance freedom, it creates chaos, and chaos kills democracies. The United States system of ordered liberty offers multiple ways to raise claims of malfeasance without compromising national security. Federal agencies have inspector generals. Congress routinely investigates such claims, and Snowden had the legal option to take his concerns to any sitting member. The notion that he had no option but to leak is utterly indefensible. Finally, Snowden betrayed the trust he was given by the US government to safeguard the nation's secrets. Free societies depend on a trustworthy citizenry. Picture a world where lawyers, doctors, police officials, and others in positions of trust were to decide that they, as individuals, were the best arbitrators of what information should or should not be dumped in the public sphere for discussion. Edward Snowden gave himself that authority. Why shouldn't your therapist or your gynecologist?
Libertarians?
Edward Snowden's actions, while illegal, were necessary for the health of our representative democracy. Such a system depends upon an informed polity, aware of its government's policies with respect to their rights. Only then can voters be expected to exercise informed control over the actions of their government. Many of the NSA's powers were assumed secretly and were not public knowledge. Until Snowden's leaks, the American people did not know that under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, their cell phone providers were required to give their metadata to the NSA, or what information that metadata contained. They did not know that X-keyscore allowed the NSA to view their web traffic, or that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court had interpreted reasonable suspicion to include the data of persons up to 3 degrees of separation away from the NSA's intended target. Without knowledge of the NSA's activities, American voters were prevented from exercising democratic control over their government. These powers were themselves dangerous, and, especially while secret, could be misused to influence the course of politics by selectively leaking information pertinent to persons disliked by the administration. We would have no way of knowing if this were happening. Think about what J. Edgar Hoover did to civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. He faced far greater technological limitations. The NSA essentially has none. Now, for actual harms done by NSA surveillance. In 2004, a woman working for the National Security Agency listened to audio recordings of her husband's phone conversations to be sure wasn't cheating on her. Men working for the NSA regularly collected incidentally shared nude photographs of Americans and passed them around the office. These are real security violations, and these are only the ones that we know about. Snowden's leak sparked a long overdue national debate regarding state surveillance. It wouldn't have happened without his actions. This debate culminated in a vote on the USA Freedom Act, in which elected representatives followed the wishes of their newly informed constituents and limited the NSA's Section 215 power. This is how we do things in a democracy. While Snowden's actions may have been illegal, they were necessary. We were working in a lawless environment. Certainly, if Snowden were brought back to the U.S., he should face a trial. Perhaps he should even go to jail. But he should go to jail along with James Clapper, who lied to the Senate and to the American people under oath about the NSA's actions. Thank you.
1 minute, conservatives.
To turn a particularly attractive example back on our libertarian friends, a few anecdotes, a few stories of government misconduct does not an argument make. Our libertarian friends spent the vast majority of their speech sharing legitimately horrifying stories of individual government employees misbehaving in the workplace. I counted 3, 4, perhaps even 5 good examples of government employees overstepping their bounds. I'd like to refer you to another number, though, 1,500,000. That's the estimate of how many intelligence programs Mr. Snowden stole and dumped on the internet. If we're going to have an honest discussion as to whether or not Mr. Snowden's actions were justified, which is the topic at hand, we have to look at it in terms of cost and benefit. Mr. Snowden cost us an absolutely unknown amount. What he gained us? Potentially 2 out of 1.5 million things to talk about.
1 minute.
Yeah, I'm happy to concede to the conservatives that we had relatively few stories to talk about. This is in no small part because many of these stories aren't talked about. They should really be talked about more. It's also worth noting that our conservative friends did not cite the real damage that was done by Edward Snowden's leak. That's because we have no substantive reason to believe that American lives have been lost or American military action has been threatened by his leaks. And so the trade-off is not so much the number of documents, which they previously admitted were not terribly relevant, that he stole, and rather the underlying question of were his actions justified. And it seems to me that what's really at stake is the respect for the privacy of the American people. The important takeaway from the story of Edward Snowden is that our digital interactions are watched by the government with no public democratic oversight, and this represents a serious threat to our liberty. This should concern the conservatives as much as the libertarians.
So then we all agree. We'll go on to the fourth question next, and we'll start with the libertarians and then go to the conservatives. American military dominance makes us safer, freer, and more prosperous. Go.
When examining the value of American military dominance, we must consider not only its visible benefits, but its costs, those seen and unseen. We obviously need a strong military. Our government has an obligation to defend its citizens, and our Navy beneficially protects international trade. This being said, how large a military do we really need? Should we prepare to fight the whole world? Where but in the military budget do conservatives look at a $600 billion government expenditure and say, not enough? We spend as much on defense as China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, Japan, and Great Britain combined. The United States accounts for approximately 75% of all NATO spending. We both oppose boundless welfare spending at home. Should we continue to subsidize the defense of European social democracies on the backs of American taxpayers? By encouraging our allies to spend less on defense, they are left dependent upon promises of aid. The United States is therefore the linchpin of any international peacekeeping effort. Shaken by our losses in Somalia, when we did not step in to stop the Rwandan genocide, our allies had neither the strength nor the will to do so. As well, unilateral American intervention encourages unilateral action on the part of other nations, many of which are hostile to U.S. interests. Our interventions themselves often make us less safe. By removing Iraq's Ba'athist regime, we set the stage for the ascendance of ISIS, which poses a far greater threat to American lives than Saddam ever did. As well, it opened the door to expanded Iranian hegemony in the area. Our intervention in Libya created a dangerous security vacuum, allowing weapons to flow into Syria while giving violent Islamists a staging area for attacks upon neighboring Mali. Military dominance incentivizes irresponsibility in our allies while leading us into unwinnable foreign entanglements. It also makes us less prosperous. State investment is not required to drive American technological innovation. If it were, we might as well put the government in charge of all of our technological research. Conservatives accept the law of diminishing marginal returns in the private sector. Why do they dispute that this economic law also applies to military spending? We see the bullets and bombs our defense budget purchases, but we never see the roads that money could pave or the bridges it might build. Furthermore, we are made less free by our military dominance and militarism. From the Alien and Sedition Acts that followed the quasi-war with France, to the forcible relocation and internment of more than 100,000 Americans during the Second World War, militarism has always posed a threat to freedom. Our seemingly endless war on terror has given rise to the TSA, the militarization of our police, the expansion of warrantless wiretapping authority and national security letter use, as well as the legalization of indefinite detention without trial. We have more military than we know how to use, and it makes us less free, less safe, and costs far too much.
Conservatives, 3 minutes.
To begin this discussion of American military dominance, we must first note that isolationism has never been a fundamental part of U.S. foreign policy, even during and immediately after the founding era. Let's look at Marion Smith's The Myth of American Isolationism, Commerce, Diplomacy, and Military Affairs in the Early Republic. Smith notes, in stark contrast to what a rigid military policy of non-interventionism would permit, the early U.S. military invaded or intervened in foreign countries with a clear goal of addressing a threat to America's vital national interests. In the country's first 70 years, the U.S. fought 6 wars, only 2 of which were actually declared by Congress. America's military engaged in dozens of brief hostilities and foreign landings abroad. They included retaliatory or preemptive attacks to deter future aggression, and troop landings in foreign territory to maintain order and protect U.S. citizens or property. Turning from the past to the present, in today's global arena, the United States has interests all over the world that require security. If we want a free market, and libertarians would likely join us in that desire, stability is required. U.S. companies do business all over the world, and their interactions benefit both the state in the form of tax revenue and the citizen in the form of better goods and services available for purchase. Resources are another area of U.S. interest. A familiar example is Middle Eastern oil or access to the Panama Canal. It would not benefit us for these markets to suddenly dry up or be taken over while we watch impotently from the sidelines. However, the largest interest of the United States in the international arena is stability. In this era of interconnectedness, chaos on the world stage has the great potential to negatively affect U.S. vital interests. To say nothing of the massive humanitarian crises global volatility invites, instability brings with it the chance for undesirable actors to take up positions of power and further deteriorate the situation. Examples of the U.S. military's welcomely stabilizing presence can be found the world over. Two good examples can be seen in the Pacific Rim, where U.S. troops have kept North Korea from rampaging across the DMZ, and where the Navy has kept the Chinese out of Taiwan. Finally, we see that involvement in foreign affairs through a strong military is necessary. A necessary evil, perhaps, but necessary nonetheless. Someone will always be the biggest kid on the block. If it's not us, who will it be? If we're not able to call the shots, someone else will, and in such a world, we would be powerless. Do we want to subordinate ourselves to the likes of Russia or China and have no way of standing up to them or whoever comes after them? Who will dictate the terms to us in a world where we are not the strongest? We have a responsibility to not misuse our power, and neither Tony nor I are going to say that we've always been perfect in this arena, but that is not an argument for abandoning it or accepting second place.
Libertarians, 1 minute.
And yet nobody has invaded Switzerland in the past 200 years, despite its lack of total global military dominance. I will agree with my opponents that from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, Americans have engaged in military adventurism since shortly after the founding of the Republic. That's objectively true. That doesn't make it good. And I think that there are two problems that I ran into in their arguments. The first one is that when they talked about the importance of the military for trade, that rang to me as just another example of crony capitalism. Why exactly should we believe that the military should be deployed to defend American businesses or promote American trade interests any more than we believe the Export-Import Bank is a good idea? I hope my conservative friends don't think that's a good idea. On the other hand, they talked about the importance of the United States for maintaining security in other nations. Yet they fall into a public choice problem here. It seems to me that where we ensure security, those other nations will not be willing to pick up the bill, as is objectively the case, for example, in all of the NATO countries.
Conservatives, 1 minute.
First off, I'd like to say no one's invaded Switzerland, probably because it's the size of Connecticut. But the biggest point that our libertarian friends made in their previous speech is that using U.S. military dominance abroad, particularly in protection of our trade, is nothing more than international crony capitalism. The United States' vital national interests are vastly different than anything like the Export-Import Bank, which chooses favorites among domestic competitors. For the U.S. to abandon its protection of its interests and its citizens and its obligations abroad is a vastly different paradigm than crony capitalism at home. The U.S. military is obligated, let's start over. The U.S. military is our best weapon to protect our obligations abroad, both obligations that we've entered into and obligations that we have to enter into by necessity. One of those would be trade. We can't simply pull out of our trade like the libertarians would seem to be advocating for.
Now that we've solved all those world problems, we'll move on to the part where we tell the other one why we're smarter than them. We'll start off with the conservatives, who have 4 minutes to explain to their libertarian friends why they should be conservative.
For this next segment, there are 3 reasons why a libertarian should be a conservative. The first is that libertarianism leads to barbarism. Murray Rothbard is one of the preeminent libertarian thinkers and is actually one of the founders of the Cato Institute. In his book, Ethics of Liberty, he examined how absolute autonomy and the illegitimacy of coercive duties, the two North Stars of the libertarian movement, apply to parents and children. The results were rather shocking. On page 100, Rothbard says, "In the free society, the only legal obligation one man has to another is to respect the other man's rights. This means that a parent does not have the right to aggress against his children, but also that the parent should not have a legal obligation to feed his children, since such obligations would entail positive acts coerced upon the parent. The parent therefore may not murder his child, but the parent should have the legal right not to feed the child. Should a parent have the right to allow a deformed baby to die by not feeding it? The answer is of course yes. Though as we shall see below, in a libertarian society, the existence of a free baby market will bring such neglect, which he puts in quotes, down to a minimum." Rothbard goes on to argue for the supposed rights of parents to sell their children on the free market. Against this barbarism, we clearly see conservatism emerging from the civilization of ordered liberty bequeathed to us by the founding fathers. The founders were conservatives. They recognized that with no one to leave it to, our liberty is only half realized. Think back to the preamble to the Constitution. It says in part, "We the people of the United States, in order to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution." Conservatism is born of this concern for the millions yet unborn, as John Adams wrote. We recognize that society is a contract between the living, yes, but also the dead who gave us this heritage and those yet to come, to whom we are obligated to pass on the blessings of liberty. Think of your grandmother's china collection. Conservatism advocates tender care for this valuable and breakable inheritance, while libertarianism calls for a casual shirking of all preservative efforts. It's not going to break, they say. Your kids will get it just like you did. But will they? Third point, libertarianism burns itself out. It fails to sustain liberty. Andrew Jackson noted that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Liberty is not a Ford that you can pretty much ignore and it'll do just fine. It's a Ferrari that requires constant attention and care. This means the individual is to be restrained only when the deleterious effects of his behavior on the larger political community threaten the preservation of the moral capacity that made that liberty possible in the first place. Will we squander our heritage and our children's inheritance in unfettered sexuality, drugs, and vague grasps at autonomy? Or will we limit our excesses to secure a better world for our offspring? Will we burn away the fabric of our society in a haze of cannabis smoke, boasting of our supposed freedom as our civilization crumbles beneath us, crushing those who would follow in our footsteps? P.D. James' 1992 book, Children of Men, tells the story of a dystopian future where humanity can no longer reproduce. There is no next generation. The youngest people on Earth are in their 20s, and no one's coming after them. In this world, libertarianism makes perfect sense. There's no one to pass on this liberty to, why not have all the fun I want? The political community is not, it cannot, just be concerned with the liberties of those in the here and now. It's also concerned with the future and with its own survival. We as conservatives are therefore concerned with ordered, sustainable liberty, not a wild-eyed sprint to autonomy and subsequent ruin. Conservatives recognize that we ourselves can destroy our liberties the fastest, and not just for ourselves, but for everyone who will follow after us. Libertarianism would only benefit from doing the same.
Well, if you're both still libertarians, then maybe offer the conservatives why they should join your side.
Libertarians and conservatives, more often than not, are allies. From the New Deal to SCOTUS care, the two groups have found common ground from which to rally against big government, central planning, and economic incoherence in the left. There must be, buried somewhere deep, common principles that can pull one side over to the other. In examining why a conservative should be a libertarian, let us turn to the words of one conservative in the mouth of another. In the conservative mind, Russell Kirk dedicates a chapter to his founding father of conservatism, Edmund Burke. Kirk highlights in particular one quote of Burke's, an edict upon which the conservative and the libertarian can agree. The individual is foolish, the multitude, for the moment, is foolish, but the species is wise. In the hands of the collectivist, this idea can of course be perverted, made to suggest that the will of the individual should be submitted to the whims of the collective. But Burke and Kirk do not think that the individual is lesser than the collective. The arbitrary whims of the democratic multitude can be just as foolhardy as those of the individual. Rather, Burke and Kirk's words should be read alongside the idea of Friedrich Hayek's extended order, or Frederick Bastiat's cautions against the arbitrary whims of concentrated power. In other words, conservatism needs desperately the prudence that only libertarianism can counsel. The individual is foolish, not evil, per se. but never too well informed about the world around him. Why then, asks the libertarian, should we put the individual or even the multitude in charge of regulating morality or covertly surveying innocent people? Why should we trust him to meddle in other countries' affairs? Never mind our own. People may be competent to direct their own lives, but we've not yet found a human mind competent to solve the problems of society better than a distributed approach can. Though the conservative will agree on the limiting of state power when it comes to financial deregulation or entitlement reform, he must grasp the underlying principle. Centralized decision-making produces bad outcomes, as a lack of knowledge is apt to destroy even the best-intentioned intervention. Centralized manipulation of society by guns or by tax incentives for lifting up the poor or for enforcing certain mores will always fall to the inherent limitations on our knowledge at anything beyond the local scale. The species is wise. Of course it is. We're left to grow and flourish organically, in free association, and unrestricted by state power. Spontaneous order. Orders which are, in the words of Friedrich Hayek, the results of human action, but not the execution of any human design, is a natural product of free people solving their own problems. If conservatives want organic morality, they must allow people to fail, succeed, and learn on their own. If conservatives want the organic institution of the family, they must not let the state intercede with it through the blunt force of law. And if they want a flourishing free market, then they should go all the way in getting out of the free market's way. Those spontaneous orders, the acts of the myriad individuals who compose the wise species, are the best friends the conservative has to execute his agenda. Conservatives far too often fall prey to the temptation that consumes liberals. It is fine for an order to be centrally designed so long as it is mine. Conservatives would do well to remember Burke and Kirk's rules of caution, gradual organic change, and a deference to society over the state. In short, conservatives would do well to adopt the philosophy of prudence, libertarianism.
Next, we'll go to a question and answer period, and then we'll have concluding remarks, and then we'll have cold beer. I have been really impressed with both sides. I'm feeling very optimistic about the future of the country. Don't ruin it with stupid questions. If you'd like to be called on, raise your hand and wait for the microphone for the benefit of everyone here, as well as the hundreds of people throughout the Cato Institute and people watching from around the world. Give us your name, give us your affiliation, and then give us a question.
Hello. Okay. My name is Josh Sharp. I'm an intern at Cato. I would like to readdress the immigration debate and a point that the libertarian side made. A fundamental principle with conservatism is a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So aside from the power of naturalization of citizenship, can you please describe the origin of the enumerated power to immigration policy?
That's a good question. The U.S. Constitution delegates all rights not enumerated within it to the states. And so one view one could take that immigration policy refers to the states who are on the border. However, we do realize that immigration is a national issue. And so in regards to foreign policy, so to speak, and immigration, that would fall under the Congress's jurisdiction.
Another question, white shirt, gray jacket. Sorry, I don't know everyone by name.
I'll live. Kevin Daly, Federalist Society. So I'm a conservative, but I've been a little vexed by a couple of points made by the conservatives this evening, particularly one in their opening remarks in which they suggested that the virtue of conservatism vis-a-vis libertarianism was its coherence. Yet the founder of our movement, one of the founders of our movement, William F. Buckley, wrote an essay on this topic in a volume compiled by Frank Meyer called Notes Towards an Empirical Definition of Conservatism. He offers some thoughts towards such a definition, but in fact describes at some length his aversion towards offering such a definition for the purpose of coherence. So since William F. Buckley and many of his contemporaries averred in offering a definition of conservatism because it is so hard to define, from where does your confidence stem?
That is another great question. So what we are trying to do in this debate is not define libertarianism or conservatism based on an eclectic assortment of individuals. Since within the conservative movement and within the libertarian movement, there are people who disagree. However, within both the libertarian movement and the conservative movement, there are common core principles. It's impossible to rigidly define conservatism, and it's impossible to rigidly define libertarianism. This is why we go to the preamble to the Constitution, which the conservatives highly value, and we go to common principles that stem from that passage that we read earlier, that all conservatives will hold. With libertarianism, we also did the same. We weren't going to pick on one particular libertarian and say, this one has all the truth for libertarianism. No, we went to libertarians who looked at the fundamental principles, which all libertarians will agree to, like free markets, individual autonomy, and the non-aggression principle, and we looked at where those things led. So we're not trying to offer an all-inclusive, this is conservatism, this is libertarianism. We're looking at what the central tenets are and where they lead.
I thought the Sharon statement did an all right job. Way back in the left. Gonna make the mic people run around.
Good, keep them in shape. My name is Jack Butler, work at the American Enterprise Institute, but my views do not represent the American Enterprise Institute.
Of course not.
I'm just putting that out there. I'd like to address these questions to my libertarian friends. Back to immigration, that subject we all love. Milton Friedman, someone you guys probably like, I'm guessing, once said something to the effect of, we cannot have open borders as long as we have a welfare state. Do you agree? That's the first question. I only have two, don't worry. Second question. You made a statement earlier about the cultural history of America in terms of its borders, how they used to always be open, et cetera, et cetera. But what I think you've forgotten, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that an important aspect of that cultural history was a focus on assimilation, which multiculturalism, an idea that libertarianism has no response to, has undermined today. And so immigrants who come to the United States today are not assimilated and do not become part of the American culture at large. So please, tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to both. To start with the welfare concern, two things. First of all, great, that's a really good reason to shrink the size of the welfare state. But secondarily, analyses over the course of the lifetime of first, second, and third generation immigrants suggest that they come up about net neutral as far as fiscal policy is concerned. When we look at the amount of funds that they generate for the economy, the amount of funds that they generate in tax dollars when they are taxed, the amount of funds that come out of their employment generally, it averages out to being around neutral. To address the second point, libertarians embrace multiculturalism because we embrace a free market of ideas and a free exchange of ideas, just like we embrace a free market of people. That having been said, I would contest the claim that, well, so two things. First of all, immigrants assimilate at a pretty fast rate. By the third generation, 53% of all immigrant children are intermarried. Immigrants tend to, by the second generation, track with most American political opinions. But more importantly, the early United States, those individual states were less like each other, had less in common with one another than they had in common with Great Britain. When they split apart from the mother country, they were a union of different entities, and yet they managed to find an agreement that stretched across cultures that were Catholic and Protestant, Northern and Southern. I don't see why this same principle shouldn't apply today.
Yes, ma'am.
Early America.
I'm getting tired of all these boys.
Hi, my name is Tammy Winter. I am a research fellow at the O'Neill Center at Southern Methodist University. I want to know what your your philosophical influences are, because we've heard you both cite Burke and Reagan, and then you're not Randians and you're not Rothbardians. So who are your philosophical influences?
Should we go left to right?
Sure.
So
Personally, I'm a huge fan of Friedrich Hayek. His idea of spontaneous order helps to explain a whole lot of what we see both in society and the marketplace. Beyond that, I really like Thomas Jefferson, another Thomas Paine. Getting a little bit more modern, I like a lot of Robert Nozick's ideas, not so much in how a state ought to look, but what a state shouldn't be. He does a great job of knocking down a lot of the arguments for most modern large states.
If I were to list the 3 political philosophers who have most influenced me, I would go... Don't worry, I've thought about it before. No, really, just names. I would start with Murray Rothbard. I am not an anarchist, but he does have important points. I would go to tie between Friedrich Hayek and Friedrich Bastiat. And last but not least, I'll stand by the idea that there's a libertarian reading of Russell Kirk.
Speaking of anarchy, there's a great article in an old New Guard magazine wondering if the Sex Pistols were going to be conservative. They believed in anarchy. Conservatives, would you like to name some of your...
Well, I can't really speculate to that, but people who've informed my personal political philosophy, I'd have to fall back on. I never got the why libertarians think they have a monopoly on Bastiat. Bastiat's The Law is something that informs all right-wing politics. I think it would actually sway a little more towards conservatism, especially in his recognition of equal protection of the law, not just as an end, but as a means to an end. Second, I've always really enjoyed Washington's writings. And turning modern, I'd go with Thomas Sowell, because I love economics.
I think 2 that come to my mind immediately would be James Madison, and then just in general, the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist papers. Those are phenomenal. And then if we want to look for an economic side, since we are here debating at a Libertarian Institute, I would have to say Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations. The way he introduces it and describes it in a new way for his time is interesting. I mean, I don't agree with everything he says, but it's fundamental to the understanding of modern economics.
Well-read room. All right, who's got a mean question? Left corner. A couple people really perked up when I said that.
I'm James Marsh. I'm an intern at the House of Representatives, and my question is, why don't libertarians win elections?
Well, most of us are voting Republican a lot of the time. I think the same as conservatives. Often, when they win, we win, except when it comes to civil liberties most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, like, libertarian does not equal Libertarian Party. On the other hand, libertarians have been significantly influential on the Overton window in the past 15 years. Libertarian lobbying for gun rights, for decriminalization of marijuana, for gay marriage. So if you look at surveys of people who are millennials, like my generation, our generation, they're overwhelmingly socially conservative and socially liberal and fiscally conservative, which as far as I'm concerned is a pretty good combination to be libertarians.
Yeah, honestly, we don't have to have our party win. We win the issues.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the colors that you chose for your bow tie.
Oh, yeah, it's the purple and gold, which are the colors of the Libertarian Party.
Can I add on to that real quick?
Sure.
We chose red, white, and blue.
I apologize for that layup. I interrupted you, so I've had 2 Candy Crowley moments, but they kind of even out. Maroon tie, gray shirt, I think.
Fred McGrath, the American Conservative Union. This is actually a question that stumped both groups last year. But anyways, what is both of your all's philosophy of the Federal Reserve System?
End the Fed.
as much as we would like to see the Fed, unfortunately, the modern economic system is far more complicated than that. And so I think, really, end it tomorrow? Watch everything crash and crumble.
Let me hit an ATM first.
So we would like to see a reduction in monetary policy and a gradual scaling back. We talk about prudence. The Libertarian Party is the party of prudence. I'm not seeing that over there, but that's eventually we would like to go to the direction that our libertarian friends put forth, but we would do so gradually.
If there was a run on the banks, how long could Heritage, Cato, and AEI continue to feed the interns of DC breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Blue shirt in the front.
My name is Jordan Krecky. I'm an intern here at the Cato Institute. My question is for the conservative side. You cited George Washington as one of your biggest, you're a huge fan of George Washington when it comes to your political philosophy. I wonder why his ideas on foreign policy and U.S. isolationism that he described in his farewell address, where you go astray on that. And my second question, you use U.S. economic interest to justify enlarging the U.S. military budget, but fail to recognize the economic benefit that bringing down the massive border controls would bring to the United States. So I sort of want to know why you fail to recognize the economic benefit of immigration reform, but address it and use it to justify military enlargement.
I think that comparison stands only if you view economics in a vacuum. Economics is one reason to support or tear down both of those arguments. With the immigration question, sure, maybe there are benefits to a completely open border, but economics is not the only question out there. If we're only looking at jobs, we could provide just as many jobs by building a fence on the border, or building a fence and tearing it down tomorrow, or building a fence and giving them spoons instead of shovels, so we have 10,000 times more jobs. So economics cannot be the only lens through which we view these complicated issues. In response to your first question, the principles that Washington spoke about in his farewell address tended towards isolationism. Perhaps. We certainly would like to see a little more of that. You know, the U.S. does go abroad in search of dragons to destroy a little bit. But we also need to recognize the vastly different nature of the world we live in now versus the world of the 1700s. This wildly complicated, interconnected international interregnum is far different than the world that Washington lived in, and it requires a change in policy.
Washington also invaded Kentucky, I think. How much time do we have for questions? 2 more. Young lady in the back left.
Hello, my name is Abigail Helvering. I'm also an intern at the House of Representatives, and for the purpose of this question, I guess I'll identify as a conservative. To wit, I would like to hear the libertarians address something that the conservatives mentioned in the closing statement, the question of sustainability, that we have never seen a libertarian government, fully libertarian, and much less a sustainable one. Do you think that this is a sustainable philosophy? And a point about Switzerland, they did have the Alps.
And we have the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans.
When it comes to the sustainability of libertarianism, I think that constitutional checks, if they're socially enforced and valued, are quite a useful barrier to government enlargement. When we talk about the long-term viability of a system, we also have to look at the size of government. As government expands, as government debt expands, it begins to eat up more and more of the productive private sector, and that's not a recipe for long-term success either.
Briefly, the reason to oppose the Federal Reserve, among lots of other government programs, is precisely because they centralize responsibility in single actors, such that when those actors fail, the whole system comes down with them. Centralized power in a state as opposed to distributive societies that we've advocated for this evening are less fragile, distributed societies are less fragile and more shock resistant. So I do think it'll work in the long run. I think, in fact, that more statism works less well in the long run.
One more for the ladies. Sorry.
Hello, my name is Isabel Nelson, and I'm an intern at the Heritage Foundation. I actually had a question for the Libertarians about their reading of Russell Kirk, who is actually my grandfather. And I wanted you to... elaborate on what you mean by libertarian reading of Russell Kirk and how you reconcile this with his emphasis, particularly in the conservative mind, on a transcendent moral order and the existence of permanent things that a society should defend. This is his first principle of conservatism. And also, if you're familiar with his essay, Libertarians Trimming Sectaries, in which he criticized libertarians for doctrinaire selfishness and said that that conservatives were actually had more in common with liberals in terms of a concern for a moral order. And how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I never met the lady's grandfather, but I'm going to take a shot. So I do not think it is appropriate or correct to say that libertarians necessarily do not believe in things that are morally good or morally bad. Indeed, a doctrine of rights certainly suggests that there are a negative morality, things that we shouldn't do. And beyond that, there are positive morals that can be embedded in the libertarian philosophy, a belief in personal responsibility, a belief in the value of trade, what Deirdre McCloskey calls the bourgeois virtues. So I think that when we talk about objective moral order, it's certainly the case that there are libertarians who are relativists or nihilists. I would not count myself among them. And what I would say is that the maintenance of that objective moral order, which ideally has to do with how people live well, the maintenance of that objective moral order is not best done by men with guns, but it's best done, again, by the same structure of distributed, freely associated individuals. This is what Frank Meyer's point is, that if you want to have virtue, you're going to have freedom first. That's what the libertarian thinks if he's going to believe in virtue. And I think a lot of libertarians do.
Yeah, just to add to that, a moral order is not something you find laying on the ground, pick up, and use. It's something that has to be discovered within a specific society over a long period of time. A spontaneous society and a spontaneous market better allows civilizations and societies to find these moral orders.
This has been such a good audience that it makes me wonder if the rabble-rouser had been me in years past, and that was why we had issues. Before I announce the treasure map to the bar, we'd like to give concluding statements to the conservatives and the libertarians, who will come to the podium and speak for 4 minutes, beginning with the libertarians.
Thank you all for coming again this evening. Thanks especially to everyone who's involved in organizing, and also especially to my conservative friends for their time here tonight. The space policy-wise between libertarians and conservatives is not so broad as perhaps the disagreement this evening has implied. We are allies on many points. Relaxing regulations on free exchange, the importance of robust civil society institutions, and profound respect for the Constitution are all principles that unite us. Why then ought we prefer libertarianism over conservatism? I think the key question, certainly that we've addressed so far this evening, comes down to how ought societies be structured and organized, by a central authority or by a distributed, more free market approach. Should the state limit the free flow of human capital in the name of misguided and uninformed concerns about security? Should the state collect terabytes upon terabytes of information on its innocent citizens without the oversight of a public court? Should the state pretend to be competent to deal with problems abroad when it cannot even deal well with problems at home? Should the state be the tool for one group to enforce its mores on another, or rather accept a minimal role focused on security, defense, and law and order? What exactly is the role of the state? To the conservative, the state serves as a check on the unfortunate vices of men, ensuring against their evil tendencies and ensuring a virtuous and free society. The state is the organizing arm of Burke's little platoons, making all the cogs tick along in a noble symphony. The government sits atop society, perhaps next to it, a handful of Platonic philosopher kings, prodding here and there to maintain the good behavior of their people, secure the blessings of liberty to them through prohibition on certain of those liberties, and make sure eventually that the rest of the world falls in lockstep with those same values. Libertarians, meanwhile, are forced to live in the real world. Libertarians understand that men are fallible, and that putting the power to shape society in the hands of one group, no matter how moral, will more likely produce squabbles over power than a responsible people. Libertarians understand that the world is messy, and that no central institution can shape it to its whim. Far better a whole host of diverse, freely associated persons to tackle the knowledge problem. Libertarians understand that personal responsibility and a respect for individual rights are far better organizing principles for society than centrally planned moralizing and top-down coordination. And libertarians understand that even if people can't take care of themselves perfectly, they certainly are more likely to do a good job than a host of hacks in Washington. Despite what my conservative friends will insist, ladies and gentlemen, libertarianism is not the fairy tale idealist philosophy. Sometimes conservatism is. Libertarianism is the philosophy that prefers humility over what Friedrich Hayek calls the pretense of knowledge. It is the philosophy that puts more trust in the individual to solve his own problems than people uninterested in doing right by him. And is the philosophy that realizes that spontaneous order, the ending of restrictions on trade, on free association, on immigration, on contract, is the only proper way to secure the blessings of liberty promised to all of the people in this room. The libertarian favors liberty. So too does the conservative. What the libertarian understands that the conservative does not is that liberty cannot be grown or fostered by central decision-making or the enforcement of law. It can at best be defended, at worst annihilated. If we are to have the kind of society which I imagine both I and my conservative friends would like to see, a society of good and virtuous people, living happy, prosperous, free lives, then it is through libertarian principles and a libertarian vision that we will achieve it.
Again, Tony and I want to thank everyone for coming out here. We'll be brief in closing because I'm sure everyone is in the mood for some beverages. And now, in these closing moments of the debate, we'd like to focus in on what have emerged as some of the crucial differences between conservatism and libertarianism. We've agreed on a lot, but we've wildly diverged on countless other issues. So let's start by taking a look at ends versus means. For the libertarian, less and more limited government is an end in and of itself. The less government, the freer man is, and the better the situation. For the conservative, less and more limited government is equally desirable, but it is not an end in and of itself. For the conservative, less government is a means to an end. Our end is respect of the heritage of ordered liberty that we have been entrusted with, and dealing carefully with it so that our children may enjoy its blessings as well. This is done by maintenance of what we've called the civil society and the private sector, that arena of free interaction and association between the individual and the state, in an arena that the state cannot touch. That's what everything Tony and I have talked about today can be traced back to. The libertarian model promises a solution to the political problem and an almost utopian freedom, but it's a mirage in the desert. Less government for the sake of less government, with no recognition of these impacts on the broader society, does not culminate in freedom. All it will give you is a Hobbesian state of nature, one where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now let's take a look at the here and now versus the past and the future. Libertarianism places an incredibly high value on what they see as the liberties of those in the here and now. However, with all respect to our libertarian friends, this only gets half the story right. It reads the first few chapters and neglects the rest of the book. This excessive, unhealthy focus on the here and now, to the dismay of all who came before and the detriment of all who come after, this cold-hearted sacrifice of our posterity on the altar of our personal autonomy, these are inherent within libertarianism. Think back to the abortion issue that we brought up in our first speech. Nowhere do we see a better representation of libertarian principles than here, where the supposed rights, the individual autonomy of those in the here and now utterly trump those of the next generation, those who cannot speak for or defend themselves. So where do we go from here? Freedom, opportunity, prosperity. These are held up as ideals in conservatism and libertarianism alike. Conservatives are as much about liberty as our libertarian friends claim to be, but we're not so selfish as to claim it all for ourselves while denying it to our descendants. What we've seen is that libertarianism will not get you to liberty and keep you there. It only takes half the story. It seeks freedom without considering order, heritage, and civil society. So where do we go from here? We go to conservatism, a recognition that ordered liberty, not license, goes hand in hand with civil society and can only be properly enjoyed when this last flourishes. So let's together consider building an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish so our descendants can be as free as we are. Thank you all for coming.
So then we all agree. I'd also like to thank the Cato Institute for hosting us and putting this on. It's been fantastic. And thank the Heritage Foundation for the unaffiliated conservatives to our right. The reception tonight is on the first floor Winter Garden, which is a realm, and the conference center on the second floor. They've opened both of it up for our enjoyment and for our continued debate. Thank you all for coming, and let's get a round of applause for our supporters and panelists.